My name is Rick Ufford-Chase, and my wife Kitty and I are co-directors of Stony Point Conference Center and co-founders of the Community of Living Traditions, a multi-faith community committed to the study and practice of nonviolence. I was the moderator to the 216th General Assembly in 2004, serving until 2006.
My name is Bruce Reyes-Chow. I'm a pastor and writer and speaker who resides in San Francisco, California. I was moderator of the 218th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. I grew up in a church, and for the longest time that seemed to be the journey I was on. I was detoured a little bit to law school and then really wanted to go into ministry, and there was a moment where my mother said to me, you should think about seminary. And that was the turning point because she had not said that to me before.
And I'm a preacher's kid. Like Bruce, my dad is a Presbyterian minister. I grew up in a large Presbyterian church in South Central Pennsylvania, and I loved everything about church. My earliest childhood memories are, being this high and standing next to my dad, greeting everybody as they left church on Sunday morning. And in many ways, that's the craft I learned from him. And I fully expected that I would become a pastor, or what we now are calling a teaching elder. And I started seminary in 1985 at Princeton and lasted one long semester, and then bailed out in part because the more I did, the more I realized that there was a real need for elders who were fully committed to providing leadership in the church. My path to being moderator, I spent a lifetime doing mission service on the U.S.-Mexico border, primarily focused on the issues for migrants and refugees and human rights work in the Arizona-Sonora borderlands. And there was a particular trip where I was leading a group of seminarians from Chicago, from McCormick Theological Seminary, on a trip looking at the issues for migrants who were dying in the desert. And we were staying one night in a shelter just south of the Arizona border in a town called Altar, where at that time hundreds of thousands of people a year were coming through this little tiny town trying to find their way across the border. And it was just a particularly compelling day. We met with people who had pretty remarkable stories. And so I'm lying there on the floor that night in a shelter for migrants, and I just couldn't sleep. So I got up and I journaled all night long, and at one point about 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm trying to figure out I know the church cares. I know we could care if we just knew, and how could we get the word out? And I thought, maybe moderator.
A lot of people, as Rick and I were elected fairly close together, initially thought, oh, it's another young person. But we come to this church from very different perspectives and experiences. Mine comes out of working with young adults within kind of the system. I really felt at a certain point that there was a need for the moderator's office to have a voice for somebody who didn't just think about what the church was going to be, but actually began to practice that. And I had been part of a new church development in San Francisco that had begun to do pretty well. It was an unapologetically Christ-centered, Presbyterian, urban, progressive church. And so had listened to some folks and gathered some friends around to think about this moderator's office, knowing that in many ways it has a lot of influence and in many ways it has very little influence. At a certain point you hear the call and you have to say yes or no, and dove full into it at a certain point.
Really, I thought that I was seeking to be moderator, kind of following that call, in order primarily to lift up the issues for displaced peoples around the world and to talk about the call of the church to follow Jesus into service in the lives of those folks who are most at risk. And I had that opportunity. I was really blessed. But what surprised me, really two things surprised me. One was my assembly, which was 2004, there was an issue that came before the plenary, the full assembly, around whether we should begin a process of phased selective divestment from companies that were benefiting from or profiting from or supporting the occupation of Palestinian lands in Israel. And I had actually been to Israel and Palestine with Christian peacemaker teams and knew more than a little bit about what was going on there. And so it was an amazing thing when that overture passed, really, with more than 80% approval. It's a remarkable thing. It's been so controversial since that we don't really think about what spiritual thing took place that week. The church came under significant attack, both from within and from without. But as I went along, It also gave me the opportunity to meet some amazing people who were not angry, Muslims across the country who gave awards to the Presbyterian Church for its human rights stance and the boldness of our position. And I got to go and receive those awards on behalf of the whole church. I mean, I came out of it, and my wife, who's Quaker, and I decided that this was a moment where we would change gears entirely in our lives. And we have both, over the next 2 years, rearranged our lives and reoriented our lives toward multi-faith work and the work of trying to reach across boundaries to do nonviolence work in the world.
I think I benefited from Rick's term in Rick's ability to broaden conversations and hold a position about things, but still remain fair and have folks respect and trust. And I think that openness and that honesty and transparency was a shift not only in the moderator's office, but just culturally. So my term was really about future of the church. And so I was moved over and over again that folks were not being defensive about change, but it was, okay, but what do we do? We're seeking to know where God is leading us as a denomination. And that is a very different posture than I'm scared of what's going on. And I think that marked a lot of it. I think specifically my term was a lot about technology and the use of digital media. And somebody asked me, do I take credit for anything during my term? I'm like, well, if you're bothered by all the Presbyterians on Twitter, that might be my fault. Sorry.
And your legacy.
And my legacy,
Marvelous.
Exactly. Our time as moderator helped bring, I think, some energy and some excitement about the possibility that the church can be a force of change in the world. And it's not just us, but it's about this broader place that we've committed to.
So when I got elected, I didn't even know what a blog was. And somebody came up to me like the next day after I was elected and said, I'm a blogger and you should be one too, you'd be a natural at it. And I thought, okay, that'd be fun. So I said to our handlers, you know, moderators have handlers, I said, I want to be a blogger. Get me a blog, right? And the answer came back 3 days later in the midst of all the craziness of the assembly, we're sorry, we don't have the technology. And I'm thinking to myself, every 16-year-old kid I know has a blog. How can you not have the technology? And the answer really was not, we don't have the technology. It was, we, the institution of church, don't know how to cope with somebody who might go off message. So after the assembly was over, I quietly said to this guy who had come up to me, would you help me with this? And he said, sure, no problem. So a couple of weeks later, he sends me a link to a blog spot, right? He says, here you are, you're all set up. And we named it You See What I See for Ufford-Chase, right? You See What I See. Yeah. And he said, play with it a little bit. I won't go public yet. Just, you know, write a few. So I wrote a couple. And 2 weeks later, he sends back a note. He says, you're a natural. How about if I do a press release? I said, great. So he does this press release and he sends it to the Presbyterian News Service. And the next thing we know, it's live. The moderator's blogging. And I get called into the office in Louisville. We don't do things that way here. It was the only temper tantrum I threw while I was moderator. In 2 years, it's the only time I lost my temper. And I said, if you don't want me to do it on my own, then work with me, because the church is going to change. So then, you know, I'm done, and Joan came in as the next moderator. And then, you know, in 4 short years, Bruce steals the title as youngest moderator since who knows when, right? And takes over. And I could feel the generational shift there between me and Bruce. It was really a remarkable thing to watch. And sure enough, Jack Haberer with the Presbyterian Outlook does this editorial. I don't know if you remember, like a month after Bruce gets elected, Jack writes this editorial about technology and how Bruce Reyes-Chow is doing this stuff. And he says, suddenly, Ufford-Chase seems oh so 2.0. You know, kind of, he's so much yesterday's version, and today we got this new thing going on. The church is shifting dramatically, and really, my hope is that the moderatorial office both leads it just a little and reflects it for the rest of the church and tells the story to try and connect it all together.
As you age, your roles shift. You're not being left behind. But you're being called into something new. Mm-hmm. Just like me, as a 20-year-old or as a 30-year-old and as a 40-year-old, my role in the church has to shift, and I have to claim that and embrace it and not have any resentment about it. My being younger at that point gave this opportunity to talk about generational shifts and age and roles in the church that probably wouldn't have been the same way if I was much older. If a community has the intentions to be open to young folks, that will be seen and heard. An authentic intention to want young people in the church, as vague and general as that is, if you can embody that and that comes from your gut, then young folks will see it and be more drawn to a community that owns that.
I knew from the moment I was elected that it was not about being young, it was about being a bridge.
This role shift for us where, 15, 20 years ago, we were the ones that people were saying, what should we do? And we go out and do it. And now I think our role is to help till that soil and really nurture a way that folks can live into that leadership without macromanaging them, without saying, here's where you have to go, but providing some grounding for young folks to really kind of live their faith. I'd often start some of my talks when I was moderator and I would say, I don't actually care about the future of the U.S.A. And then say, but keep listening to me. Because institutionally, I'm not doing this, I'm not following this call into ministry to maintain an institution. But do I believe there's something about the Presbyterian flavor of the Christian faith that's important, that we discern the mind of Christ and the will of God together, and that infiltrates and influences us at all levels of our life together? Yes. Was there anything I would do differently?
I don't think so. For me, I felt like it was a magical moment. Did I make mistakes? Yeah, and I made some real doozies. I said things that I wish I wouldn't have said. I spoke too fast sometimes. I didn't consider things enough once in a while. But overall, I felt like God put me and the church at that moment in time together in that role for a reason.
Part of our charm is that we say things too quickly and often
stupidly.
Stupidly, exactly. But I think part of it is also we'll come back and go, I probably shouldn't have said that. I mean, I think there's an ownership of that I think was part of why I think we connected with folks in many ways, because it was just like everybody else. We say things and we need forgiveness, and then we try to move on.
What worries me is not that the church is going to change. It's that we will back into it step by painful step, instead of looking forward and being proactive about where the church is going to be 20 years from now. Now, how can we go there in 5 years? It's not that we're creating something new, it's that we have to know how to tell the story of our past in a way that opens up possibilities for the future. All the fundamental teachings of Jesus come down to where we choose to locate ourselves. Are we going to stand with the people who are on the edges and the margins, who have been excluded, and are we going to broaden the circle and invite those folks into the community? I guess we could say living history is about making history. So I'm conscious, as I kind of think about the historical moment in which I live, that I want to be remembered for standing where Jesus would have stood.